Welcome to Broadcast Astrology, Insight for Humans.
This is Lisa Pesnichek.
And I'm Sara Beckner, and we're here to deep dive into the fascinating world of astrology.
We offer blind chart readings, interviews with notable guests, and much more.
So keep listening as we bring you Insight for Humans. Hello, and welcome to Broadcast Astrology, Insight for Humans. Lisa and I are thrilled to be hosting Christina Caudill this morning. And we'll just dive in and let her tell us a little bit about herself. And today we get to talk about eclipses.
It's eclipse season.
Eclipse season is upon us. Yeah.
We're in the eclipse vortex. So, I always look forward to eclipse season. Well, I am Christina Caudill. Thank you both for having me on to your podcast. I'm really honored. And I'd love to chat with you about astrology. And this is a really fascinating topic. My background is evolutionary astrology of the Mark Jones school. So it's blended mostly with a counseling sort of orientation. But essentially, evolutionary astrology looks at the evolution of the human soul. But nowadays, when we're looking at so much to do with the collective, especially thanks to Pluto going to Aquarius, it seems that mostly what the collective is concerned with is collective evolution. And that is really about every individual soul taking responsibility for their own evolution. And that is how we have this collective. And a lot of the work is based on the work of Carl Jung. But Jung actually believed that the collective was sort of a lower level mind than the individual, right? Because the collective can't necessarily have that sort of foresight to control things. It just goes by nature and by instinct. But we tend to see in astrology, especially during eclipses, how the collective is moving, kind of what direction. And it's something that we can't really judge as good or bad. The ancients believed that eclipses were calamitous. And certainly we've seen that at times. Other times we can see that they can be amazingly bring forward amazing sort of magic and miracles and dreams come true. And they always tend to move us. They change our lives and change our destiny. And that is because they're aligned with the lunar nodes, which we consider the axis of transformation, the axis of destiny. It goes by all these different names. But for some reason, these points in space, they really tend to move evolution along. And we can look at the South Node as having to do with the past. We can look at the North Node as having to do with future evolution and growth. But as we were actually talking before we started recording, I know Sara was saying that how the nodes, even the North Node, can sometimes kind of trick us into wanting more and more and more. Like the Eastern view is there's this hunger, right? Like that is never satiated. And we think that's going to solve our problems by getting more, being fed more, when it isn't necessarily true. But we know that these are powerful times because our luminaries are activating the nodal axis. And also looking deeply at each eclipse during an eclipse season, I think is very valuable, but also keeping in context that there is eclipse storylines. And that can be from eclipse season to eclipse season every 6 months. But I like to especially look at eclipses in certain signs, right? Because that's the archetypes that they're activating. And they'll be also activating that same area in your chart or in a chart. So we were even looking at 9.5 years ago when the lunar nodes were in the opposite signs that they are in now, in Pisces and Virgo. And there was a storyline there that came up, right? And so now, what is happening again in that storyline that you may have forgotten about, or it may have gone dormant? And we can look at that both personally and collectively. So that's a little sort of overview as I see it.
Beautiful. So, just to give our listeners a little bit of an idea, how often do we receive, is there eclipse seasons? How does that, can you explain how often that works?
Right. So every 6 months we have eclipses, and they're either in pairs of 2 or sometimes in 3s. And so, you had asked me before too about timing wise. So a lunar eclipse that we just had yesterday, right? We had September 7th, we had the Pisces lunar eclipse. A lunar eclipse is a full moon that is within, I believe it's 12 degrees or less, or 11 degrees or something of the lunar nodes. So it's aligned with the lunar nodes because it's a full moon. Now, the experiences of a lunar eclipse, because we know the moon moves so fast, right? It's moving quite quickly. We tend to see the fruition of that because lunar eclipses, as our full moons, are all about illuminating and things coming to culmination. We tend to see that very close to the actual event within a few days or, before or after the event, because it illuminates something that's been ripening. And it's mostly about the moon, which has to do with our emotional life, our emotional attachments, and things like spirituality, especially in a spiritual sign like this. And anything that the moon represents to women, care, nurturance, and also homes. A lot of times people think of moving homes during that time, or who they're emotionally attached to and who they aren't. But then when we get to solar eclipse, that's trickier because the sun has obviously a year sort of orbital period. And so we look to those as being more so about the experience of that year. I mean, the actual solar eclipse event, when something is eclipsed, because again, it's a new moon within, I think it's about 17 degrees within close to one of the lunar nodes. So it'll either be by the north or the south node, it being a new moon. Sometimes we can actually see that the darkening of something or someone, the sun representing usually a leader of some kind or someone in the spotlight. And it's consciousness too. Our own consciousness can feel darkened or in shadow, or we suddenly feel confused. Where we were, we may feel confused or unsure. And typically, for whatever reason, I don't know, this traditionally, is that men or father figures can tend to be eclipsed during that time. So I've seen, say, a woman who's had a solar eclipse on her sun, and she's having problems with. I had one friend who has problems with her husband, her boss, and her father. All for some
All the
reason.
men.
Right, because we still project that solar light onto the men. I mean, maybe that's something we need to evolve beyond. But, that's another thing. The timing can be trickier because with solar eclipses, they can change the course of our life, right? So when does the actual event happen? I remember I had a friend who had a solar eclipse on her sun, and then nothing seemed to really happen then other than just her being in this sort of really unsure place. And after about a year, when I spoke to her, everything had changed. Her relationship with her father, her boss, and her husband had all changed. So it could take some time, but I was interested in that year process. When the sun comes back around to that point, has everything major had a moment to come to light? So it can be trickier, but we certainly want to look at the week before and after that eclipse. I like to look at an eclipse season as the lunation before the first eclipse, right? So we had the first eclipse was a full moon in Pisces. So there was a new moon in Virgo 2 weeks before that. Then, and this is kind of unusual, we have another new moon, which is a solar eclipse in Virgo 2 weeks later. And then we'll have the lunation 2 weeks after that one. I'm not sure what it is, but it'll be a full moon. To me, that is an entire eclipse season because and it also pretty much aligns with the degrees of the lunar nodes, being within certain degrees of the lunations. So it's usually about 6 weeks, but if we have a third eclipse, then it'd be 8 weeks. But that's the time where time can be warped, and sometimes we don't really notice it until then it's over. And then we're like, I finally landed back into my normal life. And so they say don't make any big decisions around eclipses or during eclipse season. Sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes it is happening, and life is changing. And it's not about us making the decision or not. It's about things that are bigger than us sort of happening to us.
Absolutely.
Do you see with your clients larger storylines that occur around that 1.5 year, 2 year window of those eclipses taking place along in those zodiac
The signs
axes.
that they
And
tend
then
to be.
also, like, I'm curious, there's a local astrologer here where I'm at that does a lot of work around looking at the larger cycle of when those points return to the exact same degree they were, which would be more of a 19-year cycle. And so there you've got that bigger, like, 19 years. You've got the 1.5, 2 years where it's occurring on that in the house, the family of zodiac signs. Then you've got this smaller season that occurs. You're talking about the 1 year, and then this 6 month, and then this little kind of almost, what would it be? Just
In the 2
like 6 weeks, or like
6
just
weeks.
in the spring and fall, right when those cluster of eclipses are occurring, those 2 or 3 eclipses. And then you've got this little window, like what we had yesterday with the moon, that we're still feeling that eclipse with the moon in Pisces, and as long as the moon is in Pisces. So it's almost like little nesting dolls. And I'm wondering if you really see that in people's lives.
Yes, and I think it depends on what they're coming to me for and how open they are to looking at something bigger. Usually, when someone is booking a reading, they're like, something is happening right now, and which way should I go? And I can't make a decision. And an early teacher of mine had said that, during especially the solar eclipse period, we can't see the consciousness, the light, our light, the sun, but also symbolic of the light of consciousness is darkened. So he always said, wait and see, to wait until at least the 2 4 weeks until the sun gets back into light. And then you'll see more. And maybe we won't be so freaked out about not knowing, especially with this Virgo energy. We could be crashing out, as they say, the young people like to call it, because we just don't know where things are going to land. But to what you were saying about what is the timing to look at, I like to look in terms of what is happening in the life. And if someone is like, I have a major decision, a life changing one, then I would start getting curious about how long has this been going on? Has this been going since the last 6 months ago, that eclipse season? Is it worthwhile because it's something that's a bigger decision, that there's an echo from that 9 years ago? If I have clients that are really curious and really want to know more, then yes, if they can remember that 19, like if it's a marriage or something bigger like that, a career or something, well, then I would look at how about 19 and a half years ago? What was happening at that time? And I do love it when people I work with tend to be more and more open to start seeing that maybe 19 years ago, they were just going by what was happening to them. And now they're ready to say, okay, back then, maybe I felt more powerless. Now I can be more conscious and see where things are taking me. And more like, where is life taking me? What can I serve in life rather than just that I'm the one to write the agenda? Because we know that we're not. We're not the ones writing that agenda. But I definitely would look at when eclipses are in the same signs at the very least, because to me, that's the archetype that is being activated. And so we were talking before that these eclipses in Virgo Pisces, they started in 2024 and they will continue until 2027 with some other ones in between from different signs. But that's even longer than when the lunar nodes are in those signs. So that's just something to kind of consider as well. But when we look at our own natal chart, and I mean, I use Placidus and any other timed house system, but I also like to use whole signs just because to me that does give me sort of this sort of very clean sense of what is happening in these signs that rule certain houses in my chart.
Yeah. It's a
And
handy tool.
yeah, and that can also just bring more clarity, I found, if the client is open to it. Some of them don't want to hear anything about it. Some of them, they've spent 40 years looking at their chart in Placidus, which I understand. But I like to look at that and see what are these storylines that keep repeating in this area of your chart. And then, is the North Node in this area in your chart, or is the South Node in this area of your chart? Because I really do see where the nodes are transiting tends to be, whereas the opportunity for growth is the north node, and the south node, maybe there's something there that can still be of service, but that it's kind of served its purpose of growth in the past. And that's not where the growth is. Like, for instance, if you have the south node going through the 10th house, I almost always see clients saying, oh, this is the time I really want to make strides in my career, in my business, in my public image, in my leadership. And they have this sense that things are really happening when I know that the north node is going through their 4th house, the bottom of the chart, which is really, really asking for personal development, like inner self, more than just self-development for career purposes, but the inner self knowing development. And sometimes that means a fall has to happen for you to get back into what really matters. What's the most important thing that's grounding yourself in your chart? That's just one example. But I wouldn't fight where the lunar nodes are transiting to your chart. And it can be even more illuminated with eclipses because they're illuminated by the luminaries.
Mhm. Beautiful. So, I mean, I guess just one like eclipse in general question is a lot of people tend to look at the eclipses as indicating something that's fated, like almost fate's hand dipping into your life and turning it in whatever direction it needs to go in ever so softly most of the times, hopefully. Is that the same way that you look at it, or do you have a different perspective?
I tend to look at it as destiny rather than fate. And to me, I feel like there's a slight distinction there in that destiny is like what you do with what you're handed, kind of thing, right? Like if
Beautiful.
fate is what you're handed, then destiny is what are you going to make of it? Are you going to make lemonade out of lemons or what have you? And it's not always so cut and dry when it's like, something bad is happening. Like sometimes, yes, it does feel like, okay, like I've had a loss in the family or something majorly that was devastating to me. But how many times have the most challenging things in our lives turned into something of self growth, self understanding, or expanding our consciousness, or relying on our own ability to be resilient or to be more real about the direction of our lives or what have you. So these cut and dry things about good and bad aren't, I don't know that they're always necessarily true for eclipses, but I do feel like that it is often turning points, especially say when you're going through the lunar nodes or say square your own lunar nodes. I especially see those are times like, oh, which way do I stay in my comfort zone? It's really tempting. Or do I go grow more, even though feels really awkward and feels unsafe? Um, I often see that those are times of decisions and turning points. So maybe we can feel like this is going to be a big step if I go in this direction. I don't know if I'm ready, and sometimes we're not. Like, for instance, it's said that when we're children, we might have easily reached for our natal north node. Like, it's like, oh, sure, let me like go there and be an astronaut and be a movie star. And maybe we've done things that kind of were expressive of that. But then as we go through life, then we start to kind of bump into whether it's reality or fear or insecurity. And then we find ourselves retreating back to our natal south node. And I think that the transiting nodes can work in that similar way too. They can invite, they can offer opportunities. Although sometimes with eclipses, if they're really activating your chart, then it can just be like pushing you forward or something like that, or pushing you through the door. And like we were also talking about earlier, is like you and me, Lisa, we were like, oh, this lunar eclipse, knock on wood, it didn't really do anything like in our lives. But Sara, you had some experiences, and I know some other people that it was like really just acting like a tidal wave in their lives. So just because an eclipse is coming, we don't necessarily need to fear it, but I would be curious to see how it's aspecting our natal points or planets.
Yeah,
Yes.
so it's worth, pointing out that it's not going to touch everybody every time because when you're on social media, there's all this barrage of eclipse fear that comes in the spring and it comes in the fall. And really, you need to look at your own personal horoscope and your natal story and see where these things are intersecting. But I love the way you opened up, Christina, talking a little bit about the collective. And I love the fact that you said that Jung talked about the collective as being this sort of neutral thing. And maybe our destiny is where we use our consciousness to respond to that collective energy towards our own growth. And I think both of you had, when we were talking before we started recording, both of you had some interesting stories about how this eclipse is playing out on the mundane level. Um, so yeah, we want to dive into that?
Yeah. Do you want me to bring up the eclipse that just occurred yesterday on September 7th, the total lunar eclipse in Pisces? Let me grab that real quick. So here is that it took place at 15 degrees Pisces, 22 minutes. The moon was conjunct the north node in Pisces. And this chart that we're looking at here is cast for Washington, D.C., which usually just gives us an idea from a predictive perspective as far as how it's affecting the nation, the United States. So that's why I brought that up. But anybody want to dive in and
I mean, quickly before we dive in, can I ask you a question, Christina, just from a technique perspective? Like with this Saturn conjunct the North Node, it's a little out of orb when we look at it relative to the moon. Would you pull that in because it's closer to the North Node? Would you pull that into the eclipse story, or is that too far away?
You know
Consider?
what? So my teacher was Mark Jones, and I mean, it's been a long time since I've been taught by Mark Jones, but some of the things that I really believe in, like what he says, is a lot of times we just look at the chart by eye, and you can see by eye, they're all clustered there. So that is a cluster of energy there. And so, yes, when things are 3 degrees, whenever I really pay attention to, okay, now that's really being activated as a near conjunction. But I like to look at things by eye also and say that all of these, this Saturn and the moon really, especially, is so close to the North Node. But certainly to me, Saturn, and and even Neptune, but especially Saturn having just entered Pisces or re-entered Pisces, I feel like that Pisces energy. And it's interesting because we think of the North Node as being growth and expansion and very sort of Jupiterian, I like to think of it. But interestingly, Saturn is there, and Saturn is restriction, right? So it's the restriction and that Saturnian sort of authority, even though it's retrograde, kind of heading back to that North Node. And I love the fact that they're so close. The sun and the moon are within 3 degrees of the node. So that's a total lunar eclipse, right?
yeah,
It's like
it
pretty
is.
total.
Yeah,
And
it's very
and
close.
those plus the trine of Jupiter in another water sign, will trine to the North Node, also very tightly at 19 degrees, is to me, that's the major thing I'm looking at. And that's what seems to have, like when I look at the stories that were in the collective, like one of the first things I had noticed was the Powerball in several of these states had ballooned up to $1.8 billion, which is like pretty unusual or pretty huge. But it was kind of slow coming because people kept not winning the Powerball number. And they're like, no one's going to win this. And finally, that Saturday night, just several hours before the lunar eclipse, two people won it. And two, I think, of Gemini. So, Uranus was stationing at the time in Gemini. So it's like it finally got that release with the Gemini, with the Jupiter, of that Powerball. And when I think of like the Jupiterian coming through, normally, if I would say it's between Jupiter and Saturn, Saturn's restriction tends to weigh heavily when we're dealing with aspects and things. But Jupiter, I think, was very prominent in this because it was such a tight trine to the North Node and the moon, that I feel like it's really, in many cases, and that's not necessarily always positive. It could be the release that we're seeing in a lot of these cases that we'll talk about.
When I did my write-up for this eclipse, the thing that came to me, and it just is making even more sense in looking at this chart with you guys today, it was blowing bubbles. And bubbles are fun, they're joyful, but they also pop. And part of my thinking is that there's something about the bubbles that we're blowing now, like the optimism, the big money, all the things that I'm wondering might begin to pop even in the next couple weeks as we reach this next eclipse later on. And I guess one thing that just looking at this chart too is this is very, very similar, like within a degree or almost, yeah, within about a degree of the same axes, MC, IC, ascendant, descendant as the US Sibley chart, which kind of makes this more personal, I think, for the United States too. And in the whole bubble blowing theme too, we have Neptune conjunct the IC, which is also currently conjunct the US IC if we're looking at the Sibley chart. So that's more of this foundational kind of utopia, but also the possibility that we can find ourselves in some level of being disillusioned. And so I guess I would enjoy whatever escapes you can find. And like we were talking about before, we were just kind of stumbled into talking about different ways of escaping some of the more tumultuous newsreels and that sort of things that all of us are encountering in one level or another. And I think that this chart speaks to that, maybe allowing us to take whatever, finding joy in the lottery, and was it the Powerball or whatever other things you can find joy in to just take the pressure off. I feel like that's one of the lovely invitations in this lunar eclipse. What do you think, Sara?
Well, I mean, the popping of the bubbles, that's why I started out by asking if Saturn would be a consideration here, just because it seems laden with consequences, this eclipse,
Yeah.
There's that beautiful trine, but because this is the world axis is a part of this, and like you said, it, especially when you bring in the Sibley chart and Neptune there, it just seems like the events born under this eclipse are going to be tempered or laden with more consequences, or like you said, might not be the most benefic expression of Jupiter.
Mm-hmm. Like the one of the events that I thought was so expressive of this total lunar eclipse is the deputy prime minister in the UK, like literally that Friday before she had been essentially forced into resigning. And it was a really big deal because she was really beloved. And she was on the Labour Party, but even the Tory Party, a lot of them loved her too. I mean, they called her iconic. And even this summer, even within the past couple of months, she had all this sort of iconic stories in the British press where she was out vacationing and she just looked like your everyday person, hanging out on an inner tube. And I don't know, for whatever reason, she touched something in the collective there. They thought that she was someone who cared about people because she really was about caring about the people and really calling to task a lot of these prime ministers who weren't, say, paying their taxes as they should be and things like that, or thinking about the common man. But what happened was there was some kind of confusion, whatever, of she bought an additional home and she claimed it as her primary residence. And because of that, she saved about $40,000 in taxes, whereas she should have paid that additional taxes, right? But so there was confusion on for a while. Was she wrong? Was she trying to cheat people? Things like that. And eventually it came out that the ethics committee said that while she acted with integrity, because of her position, she was the housing minister. She can't get away with that kind of thing. And even though she was willing to pay it, it was too late. So, and I had listened to a podcast that had said that the overall feeling of she had to submit her resignation was sadness from people from both parties because it was just such a shame it was like all of her potential, this great potential we tend to see with this glamorous, she was a glamorous figure too, but for the people, this very much this Piscean theme. And as you said, Sarah, the consequences, the Saturnian consequences just were inescapable for that. And I feel like that the Jupiter was, that still is that outpouring of maybe even the Pisces, I mean, the Neptune too, the outpouring of they wanting her to live up to this vision of who they thought she was. And some other people were very disappointed. They thought like, oh, there's rules for all of us, but not for those of you at the top. And they didn't think she was one of those people. And now they think maybe she was. Maybe she disappointed everybody. So to me, I feel like it's interesting that we have both this Jupiter, and I often see Jupiter as when people leave things too, because oftentimes it's like you're free of that immediate responsibility, and whether it's good or whether it's bittersweet, there is this sort of like a freedom there. But with the Saturn, to me, it's really that bittersweetness. That this is what had to happen. It was the right thing to do. She fulfilled her ethics in the end. Maybe that's the Jupiter there for her. But ultimately, the Saturn ending was really had the final word. And also, it just so happened that the next day, the Prime Minister of Japan stepped down. I don't really know all of the details on that. And then today, Monday, the Prime Minister of France is set to step down. And for him, he made a gamble on, I don't know, on some policies or whatever, which was stupid, apparently. But anyway, I thought that was interesting. 3 days in a row, well, 4 days, one was the Friday, but essentially these days right around this lunar eclipse, and it was all these second in commands having to step down, like their careers having to end at this point in their career for the good. It was all resigning, not being fired, but usually these things, the resigning is just making it look good probably. And it being a second in command, because the moon, we tend to see a lunar eclipse, they say, is either about the people, the collective emotion. It's about the queen versus the king, which is the solar eclipse is about the king or the leader. Or I'm thinking this one had a lot to do with the second in command, which also they say that the sun is the king and the Saturn is the prime minister. I've heard that before, that has often been like an association. And then we can see anytime full moon or lunar eclipse, there can be an ending of some kind, but the Saturn probably just makes it even more so. That is about taking responsibility. Saturn North Node is usually about, it's a time to take responsibility. Even though it might feel harsh, the North Node could potentially be like, this is for growth ultimately.
And I keep looking at that Mercury in Virgo too, that's aligned with this, being very attuned to the details that anything in Pisces may have missed. And so there's liability built into that as well.
Well, and I don't know how you look at it, evolutionary astrology, but in the sort of training that Lisa and I have done, Jupiter is the universal significator of money. And so it's interesting that we know 2 out of 3 of those cases had to do with money, gambling, and unpaid taxes. And then it's also just interesting in this story about the Powerball too, that money is part of this, eclipse picture.
Yeah. And then I think the other part of this eclipse story, and I think that this is going to play out and continue to play out for probably largely this month as well as into the future. But I think we might see some real prominence with this month specifically, which is the changes in the CDC, and specifically with RFK Jr. and his Maha group and movement that he's bringing into the government that President Trump allowed him to usher in, and how that's really shaking things up. And I mean, like, kind of how it is in so many areas of the country, but it's just really interesting that as this eclipse season sets in this Virgo Pisces axis, that we start to get questions of healthcare, of science, of how do we take care of our bodies, health and wellness, because that's largely, especially from a medical astrology perspective, the Virgo Pisces axis is largely has to do with health and wellness. Virgo being like the intestines, the way that the body pulls things out, and then as well as take care of our body on a daily basis, where Pisces is more of the immune system, the larger picture, how everything fits together, and also bringing in the mind, body, spirit element to health and wellness as well. So I thought it was really fascinating and not really surprising that we've had so much drama in the CDC, including I believe earlier in August, there was some gunfire that took place at the CDC. I don't think anybody was killed or even injured. I can't remember, but it did happen. When something like that happens at a governmental building, that's a big deal. And bringing in new regimens as far as vaccines, and as well as, we determine medication to be healthy, and using different standards of science while and that's very much being debated here. And I think that we can also look at this from the Virgo Pisces axis as well, where Virgo's like, we need to follow this regimen. And Pisces is like, well, we have a whole new way of believing in it. So that's what we're going to do. And blurring the edges and looking to how Pisces is both the fall and the detriment of Mercury, and how challenging it can be for these details, the step-by-step process to be played out in a Piscean North Node environment.
Yeah, and there were so many firings, right? Wasn't there a mass layoff, I think,
Mass layoff
at
followed
the
by
CDC?
really key people just leaving out of protest because, from their perspective, the science that they were being required to uphold and support was not the same scientific standard that they felt comfortable putting their stamp on and standing behind. And also, I listened to a podcast where one of the individuals, Dr. Dimitri, I'm going to Dasclaskus, he led the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases. And he was basically saying, if we have a pandemic, if any major health issues arise, people have to be really careful about what they're listening to. And I think that's always the case. And I think a lot of what we're seeing largely with all of the issues that are coming up right now within the United States specifically can all be traced back to COVID as a seed moment where this pendulum is swinging, and now we see it swinging in the other direction. And how do we navigate that?
Yeah, I can definitely see a lot of that Saturn now that I'm noticing. Yeah, a lot of what you're saying is like this Saturn North Node is so significant to this eclipse. And I wanted to make sure we didn't run out of time to talk about the solar eclipse. Are you guys
Yeah.
well with?
Yeah, no, let's go take a look at that real quick. So here we have the solar partial eclipse, which takes place on September 21st, 2025. This chart is for Washington, D.C., and it takes place at 3:54 p.m. Eastern time. And this one's a big one. It is situated at 29 degrees Virgo, 5 minutes, and which is significant in its own, just from an astrological perspective. That is what we call the anaretic degree, a degree of uncertainty, a degree of endings, a degree of chaos. But it's also situated in opposition to both Saturn and Neptune, and also very, very close within a degree, what we call the Aries point, which is a area of the zodiac, of the sky, which really speaks to the world at large. Whatever happens there tends to resonate very fully through the entire world. So in a lot of ways, this is an eclipse that the world will not be able to breeze through.
Right. And I'm just noticing that we're going to essentially have a grand trine. I mean, the solar eclipse is within a degree of getting into Libra, but it still would be within, with the Pluto and Uranus air trine, it would be pulled into that as well. So when you look at all the outer planets are impacted because Pluto, Uranus with the trine, and then Neptune with the opposition to the eclipse. That's a lot of those. All of the gods there are being pulled in and being involved in this.
Yeah, no, I didn't see that trine. Yeah, that's right. That's big.
And the solar eclipse, the main thing, if we were to just sort of break it down a little bit, is that it being opposite, as you said, the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, because it's right opposite it, because it's essentially the midpoint opposite. Saturn at 28 Pisces and Neptune at 0 Aries. So I would think it's interesting because the pressure, when I think of Saturn and opposition from Saturn, there's like some pressure, or it's pressure of an authority or pressure of some kind of karma or responsibility. But it being still traveling so close with Neptune, the Saturn-Neptune conjunction was a lot about sort of a failure of something in terms of Neptune can take, I believe that outer planets can overtake even a planet like Saturn. So there's something about that wanting that stability and that structure. And maybe we oftentimes think of Saturn as a malefic, right? But when we need, say, governmental protections or things like that, like the CDC or what have you, to be strong and to be firm and to be solid. And then the Neptune is like showing us anything that we think is so solid, it can be on shaky ground or could even dissolve or be a lot more porous than what we expect. I think that kind of thing we may see kind of being brought to light, or something is eclipsed in terms of what we think is more solid that we depend on.
Absolutely.
I can't unsee, once you started talking about the CDC, Lisa, I can't unsee the health implications. I mean, as the nodes transit Virgo and Pisces, but particularly in this picture, with Christina pointing out this grand trine. So this eclipse is ruled by Mercury in an air sign, trining Uranus and Pluto in air signs, opposing this Saturn Neptune. And so, I mean, that seems like, and especially the eclipse being in mutable signs, it seems like it would really foster transmission or spread. And there's some interesting stuff going on. I don't know if you've seen, Lisa, in Colorado, there's a papilloma virus that has hit the rabbits and the deer, and they're becoming deformed with these horrific kind of growths.
No way.
And there's been a measles outbreak in Western Colorado. And so I think
Bird flu.
this is part of the Saturn Neptune.
It's so funny because I looked back at the first eclipse in the Virgo Pisces axis that we've had in this recent eclipse sort of grouping was in September 2024. And I looked up just a quick, like September 24 CDC. And that was when they first started really reporting on bird flu being an epidemic or a potential new epidemic and people dying of it. So, and again, I don't know if it's specifically going to be the bird flu thing, but it could, when we talk about eclipse storylines, certainly what is the eclipse storyline for public health in general? Maybe the CDC is the Saturns being influenced by or affected by the Neptune, but Virgo, Pisces, to me, I think, especially the public, when we're dealing with something that's collective, and that public health, public illness too, because Pisces can very much be about illness as well as that attempt at healing. And I think the thing we always like to ask ourselves is who will be the sun figure? Who will be the sun figure that's eclipsed? I mean, we've already seen, I think the leader of the CDC is ousted or is being replaced, I believe, by someone that RFK has chosen. But now RFK is in the hot seat.
Yeah, but as long as Trump keeps backing him, I think he's going to be fine.
Well, the eclipse can still be of someone having a turning point in their career. It may or may not be the end all that will take them out, but it can be that turning point where they are sort of in the hot seat. I mean, the other thing that happened just before the lunar eclipse was Bernie Sanders calling for RFK's dismissal or resignation or whatever. And that just being like a major figure calling attention to this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I've been doing a lot of predictive work, just looking at the dial as well. And from the dial perspective, we consistently see Saturn, Neptune. We know that they're on the Aries point, which on its own is a very strong signature of illness, of the boundaries being diffused as far as our immune systems go, the boundaries that keep us healthy, and Neptune being the spread. But the other part to this that I keep looking at, and I just look at it and I'm like, look away, is that Chiron is also really tied into the Aries point at this time. It's simultaneously with Saturn, Neptune, and Chiron indicates illness as well. So I don't know if it means that we're going to actually experience whatever we're anticipating health-wise to occur now. As you were speaking earlier, Christina, there's kind of this ripple effect that can happen in a longer-term game sometimes with these eclipses. And I almost wonder if something's being set in place right now that could instigate further health complications for our nation, for the United States further on. Because we also see states like Florida saying that vaccines aren't required anymore. And then the pendulum swings, and then Oregon, Washington, and California are coming together under their own vaccine coalition and creating stricter vaccine recommendations. So, we have this whole swinging in place at this moment where nobody really knows where to stand. It feels like there's two sides pulling in opposite directions, but I think that whatever decisions are made at this time are going to have some repercussions to them. And I don't know when we're going to see that, but
Right. I just want to add one other thing is that CVS, the chain of pharmacies, the national chain, has said that they are going to be rolling out the vaccine in like 14 states or something. So I think that that's part of that Saturn story where it might be stopping the flow of the vaccine that is what is needed for the protection, or that might be the protection that isn't there fully. And you, like you said, Lisa, it could be setting up something for the later time when, when we need a vaccine or we need these protections, that they're not there.
So given everything we've just said, it probably should be noted while we're in eclipse season anyway, that there's a general caution anyway with one's health when we're in the window of eclipses, since the sun and moon do represent the body and the physiology. And I'm wondering, just in conclusion, Christina, since you're come from an evolutionary perspective, what you would suggest in terms of navigating these times and how we might do our piece in the evolution of the collective.
Well, one thing I'd like to remind people is when we look at the South Node in Virgo and the North Node in Pisces evolutionarily, we tend to see that a South Node in Virgo can be where we're doing our duty, right? Our Virgo duty in life. And we think we know what that is, whether it's taking care of our family, whether it's having these tasks and to-do lists and just doing everything right by the book. But the doing may feel empty unless we have some kind of a higher reason or calling or purpose, which is symbolic of the North Node going through Pisces. So that is part of that evolutionary story on a personal level, is that reminder of what's it all for, right? And where is it all leading us to? And the North Node in Pisces, it might not be this clear answer that you get unless you're meditating and suddenly you hear a voice that resonates with you. And sometimes we don't get that knowing until we've had an illness and we can do nothing. We're powerless, basically. We can do nothing but be in bed all day and Then where does our mind go? And then what is the essence of our life? And what is the meaning that we're bringing to our life? I can't tell you how many sort of mystical type people that I know that were big, successful into politics or into corporate, whatever. And then they got really sick and really ill and maybe even faced their mortality until they finally questioned, what am I doing this all for? Also, when we are in the sick bed, how do we get healed? We get healed through the mind, body, spirit connection. And again, for the North Node in Pisces, that can be a reminder that while the allopathic healing can certainly heal us in certain ways, this modern medicine is kind of a newer invention, right? And it doesn't care for the whole being and the whole body and the whole spirit and soul. And I think that eclipse periods are a really great time to take some time to retreat, especially during a solar eclipse. I would say the 3 days before any new moon is said to be the darkest time, right? Because it's the balsamic period. It's time of banishing in magic. You want to banish those things that no longer serve you. It's not a time of growth, but especially during an eclipse period, it's really important to ingest good, clean food and water, or even fast. A lot of traditions and ancient cultures, they fast during a solar eclipse. And especially it being in Virgo, to cleanse your environment, cleanse your space, cleanse your body, and cleanse your mind. I think that's really the best way to get the most from this, because it can be heavy with some of this dark energy that is the tension and the anxiety of everybody around us. That's so porous with us right now. So, yeah, I think it's a time to really take responsibility for knowing that the only person that's in here, that's controlling our mind and the messages coming to us is ourselves. We have ultimate control of that. And when we can silence all of the criticism and all of the anxiety, then what's left is really where we can hear the higher murmurings of the soul. And as I said, I think eclipse times are the perfect times for that.
Beautiful. I love that. So much good stuff about eclipses. Yeah, I mean, I always try to clear my schedule during eclipse season, and this time it didn't work. But I told myself that for the coming eclipse seasons, I'm just going to write it in my calendar that it's eclipse season so that I don't forget as I'm scheduling things. But
Actually, solar eclipse, I would say.
I agree.
I feel like that the more we do, it might be just like for naught anyway.
I know. I agree. Sara, do you have anything else you want to add as we close out?
No, that was beautiful. I think that was a beautiful way to end it. And it's been so wonderful. We're so grateful that you gave us some of your time today, Christina, and came on. It has been such a treat to get to know you better and have a wonderful and rich conversation. So I'm wishing both of you and everyone listening all the best as we navigate these times in this eclipse season. And stay well and take good care of your physical beings and your spiritual beings.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much, Christina. And Christina has her own podcast called Radiant Astrology Podcast. So check that out. We'll put all of her information in the show notes. You can reach out to her for readings. You put out a newsletter, don't you? Like anything else you want to put out there to the world?
Just thank you both so much for having me on. I know I reached out to you because I'd love to connect more with you, and I love your podcast, and I really appreciate this opportunity. And yes, you can check me out at the Radiant Astrology Podcast on YouTube and on wherever you find your podcasts. And again, blessings for this eclipse season.
Yeah, good luck, everybody. You can do it. All right. Bye. All of you.
Bye.
As always, thanks for listening to Broadcast Astrology Insight for Humans. And if you're so inclined, like, follow, and subscribe, and please don't be a stranger.
Signing off for now. Until next time, humans, keep your gaze upwards on the stars and be well. We look forward to sharing more soon.